It was a bright June morning in Los Angeles when the news first broke, a headline that seemed too absurd, too grotesque to belong in the world of movie premieres and red carpets. At 6:43 a.m., the LAPD received a frantic call from a neighbor in the Hollywood Hills reporting screams echoing through the canyon. The address was familiar. The home of Blake Turner, a rising film producer whose latest thriller had just opened to rave reviews. By the time officers arrived, the house was silent. The front door hung open and the scent of iron filled the air. Inside, Blake was found sprawled across the living room floor, surrounded by shattered glass and streaks of blood that trailed toward the stairs. His wife, actress Marla Deane, was sitting on the kitchen floor, trembling, a phone still in her hand. Her white silk robe was soaked red. She told the police she had found him like that when she came downstairs. But detectives noticed her eyes, calm, fixed, almost rehearsed. The Turners had been Hollywood's golden couple. Marla, once hailed as the next Meryl Streep, had seen her career stall after a string of box office flops. Blake, meanwhile, had become a powerful figure, known for his charm and his growing list of young actresses under contract. Behind the image of glamour, there were whispers, rumors of affairs, of control, of manipulation. Neighbors spoke of loud arguments at night, of things thrown, of apologies whispered through the walls. Forensics found something strange. There were no signs of forced entry. The security footage was missing between 2 and 4 a.m., the exact window when Blake had died. Marla claimed she had been asleep upstairs, sedated by sleeping pills. But the autopsy revealed a cocktail of drugs in Blake's system: benzodiazepines, alcohol, and traces of fentanyl. It was enough to kill him twice. And when investigators checked the bottles in the bathroom cabinet, every one of them had Marla's fingerprints. The tabloids devoured the case. Every morning brought new headlines: Hollywood starlet or cold-blooded killer. Public opinion split sharply. Some called her a victim of emotional abuse. Others, a cunning actress playing her most convincing role yet. During the trial, the prosecution painted her as a woman consumed by resentment and greed. Blake had recently filed for divorce. She stood to lose everything: his money, his influence, even her name in the industry. The defense countered with stories of years of psychological torment, of isolation and fear. What swayed the jury was a single piece of evidence: an email from Marla's private account, sent 2 weeks before Blake's death, to a friend she hadn't spoken to in years. The subject line read simply, "He won't hurt me again." The message below was chillingly calm: "One day he'll sleep and I won't wake him." She was sentenced to 20 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, except for the sound of a single sob from the back row. Her mother, who hadn't seen her in a decade. Blake's family left without a word. Years later, Marla gave an interview from the correctional facility, her hair gray, her voice steady. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said, staring straight at the camera. "I just wanted him to stop." The interviewer asked if she missed Hollywood. She smiled faintly. "Hollywood never misses anyone," she said. "It just finds someone prettier." The house where it all happened was sold, renovated, and listed again. But the new owners moved out after 6 months. They said they kept hearing footsteps on the stairs at 3 a.m., always stopping outside the bedroom door. It started with laughter, the kind that comes too easily when people are trying to convince themselves they're fine. In 2013, at a quiet mansion just off Mulholland Drive, actor Chase Harrow threw one of his infamous rap parties. Chase was a star on the rise, a face that looked born for magazine covers, known for his reckless charm and his appetite for chaos. His friends called him Hollywood's Hurricane. That night, the air smelled of champagne, sweat, and chlorine from the infinity pool that glowed like glass under the moonlight. By 3 a.m., half the guests were gone. The music had died down to a low pulse, and only a handful remained: Chase, his assistant, and a 23-year-old model named Elise Rowan. Witnesses later said she looked uneasy, sitting by the edge of the pool while Chase joked too loudly, too close. There were photos taken that night, blurry shots of laughter, glitter, and the hollow smiles of people who hadn't realized yet that the night would end in a body bag. At 5:12 a.m., neighbors reported screams. Police arrived to find Elise face down in the pool, her dress tangled in the filter. Chase was sitting nearby, soaked and trembling, insisting he had tried to save her. "She slipped," he told them again and again, his voice cracking. "She slipped." The coroner's report told a different story. There were bruises on Elise's arms, defensive marks on her wrists, and a deep contusion on her head consistent with blunt force trauma. The toxicology report showed alcohol, traces of MDMA, and sedatives. Her blood alcohol content was high, but not high enough to explain her drowning. For weeks, Chase refused interviews. His PR team released a statement about a tragic accident, but gossip sites were merciless. Photos of him at the party appeared online, laughing beside Elise just hours before her death. Someone leaked text messages. Elise had texted a friend, "He's not letting me leave." The LAPD launched a formal investigation. When detectives searched the house, they found 2 security cameras had been manually unplugged at 2:47 a.m. The footage stopped exactly 30 minutes before the estimated time of death. Chase claimed the system was glitchy, but technicians confirmed it had been disconnected from inside the security room. Then came the witness, a caterer who had stayed late to clean up. She told police she'd seen Chase and Elise arguing by the pool. He had been drunk, she said, and when Elise tried to walk away, he grabbed her arm and shouted something she couldn't forget. "You're not going to ruin me." The trial turned into a media circus. Chase arrived in tailored suits, sunglasses hiding eyes that never seemed to meet anyone's. His legal team painted Elise as unstable, obsessed, a party girl who couldn't handle rejection. But the evidence grew heavier. The bruises, the missing footage, the witnesses, all of it stacked against him. The verdict came after 4 weeks. The jury found him guilty of involuntary manslaughter. 5 years in prison. He served 3. When he was released, he returned to Hollywood, or at least tried to. No one answered his calls. His agent dropped him. His face vanished from billboards. The last photo taken of him was blurry, snapped by a fan outside a gas station, unshaven, eyes sunken, a ghost wearing sunglasses at night. Elise's family started a foundation in her name for victims of violence in the entertainment industry. They never mentioned Chase publicly again, but at every gala, every fundraiser, her mother wore the same pendant Elise had worn the night she died, a silver star tarnished with time. Years later, one of the guests from that party spoke about it on a podcast. "There was a moment," he said quietly, "when the music stopped and she looked at me, like she wanted to say something. I should have listened." The limousine rolled up to the Dolby Theater under a blur of flashing cameras and shouts. For a moment, no one noticed that the man stepping out wasn't smiling. Director Vincent Hale had just won an Academy Award 2 years earlier, a visionary filmmaker, a perfectionist, a man who believed pain made art real. That belief would soon turn into a nightmare no script could contain. The story began on his newest set, a high-budget psychological thriller shooting in downtown Los Angeles. Hale was known for his obsessive control, the way he'd demand 20 takes for a single tear, or rewrite entire scenes mid-filming. His lead actress, 25-year-old Zoe Carr, was his discovery, an unknown theater actress from Ohio with a fragile grace that the camera adored. She called him her mentor. He called her the future. But behind closed doors, cast members whispered. Hale's temper was infamous, his moods unpredictable. Crew members described late-night rehearsals that stretched into dawn, moments when he would scream, break props, or stand inches from Zoe's face, whispering lines that weren't in the script. He was method, one crew member said. He believed fear made the performance real. Filming halted one morning when Zoe failed to show up for rehearsal. Calls went unanswered. At first, everyone assumed she'd overslept. The cast had been shooting until 2 a.m., but by noon, her agent had filed a missing persons report. Detectives found her car still parked near the studio, her purse inside, keys in the ignition. 3 days later, hikers in Angeles National Forest stumbled upon a shallow grave near a service road. Inside was Zoe, wrapped in a production jacket from Hale's film. The discovery shattered Hollywood. Her face had been on magazine covers just a week before. Now it was plastered across every news channel with the word "murdered" stamped beneath. When police questioned Hale, he appeared calm, eerily so. He admitted to an argument the night she disappeared. He claimed it was about her performance, that she'd been emotional, that she ran off to clear her head. But the evidence said otherwise. Her phone was found in his office. The last text she sent read, "He's scaring me." Forensic analysis uncovered traces of blood in his car trunk, partially wiped but still detectable under luminol. Security footage from the studio showed Hale leaving alone at 2:37 a.m., carrying something wrapped in a tarp. 2 hours later, his cell phone pinged near the forest road where her body was found. The trial was one of the most watched in modern Hollywood history. Prosecutors painted him as a narcissistic abuser who blurred the line between art and cruelty. They called witnesses, actors, assistants, crew, who described years of manipulation masked as mentorship. The defense argued he was misunderstood, that his obsession with realism had been taken out of context. When the verdict came, Hale didn't flinch. Guilty of second-degree murder. 25 years to life. As deputies led him away, a reporter shouted, "Do you have anything to say?" He paused just long enough to look into the camera and whisper, "She was perfect." The studio shelved his unfinished film. Years later, a leaked clip appeared online, Zoe's final scene, shot days before her death. In it, she stares directly into the lens, trembling, her voice breaking as she says, "I can't tell what's real anymore." For many, that line became her epitaph, the haunting echo of a dreamer devoured by the industry that promised her immortality. Hollywood has always loved its rebels, the ones who break rules, bend reality, and live like their fame will never fade. But for one man, rebellion turned into ruin in a way no one could script. His name was Dean Kessler, a beloved television actor in the late 2000s, best known for his easy smile and sharp comedic timing. To audiences, he was the charming underdog. To those who worked with him, he was unpredictable, volatile, and spiraling fast. Dean's rise had been meteoric. From a bartender in Santa Monica to the star of a hit sitcom within 3 years, he embodied every Hollywood fantasy. But behind the laughter was a dependency no one wanted to confront. He was drinking on set, popping pills to keep the energy up, and disappearing for days between shoots. When the show ended after 5 seasons, he promised fans he was heading into film. Something darker, something real. Instead, he fell into a haze of after-parties, failed auditions, and broken relationships. In 2015, Dean met Talia Rowe, a 27-year-old makeup artist who worked on a commercial shoot he barely showed up for. She was grounded, gentle, and believed she could help him turn things around. Within months, they moved into a small Hollywood Hills home that once belonged to a silent film star. Friends said Dean seemed calmer, focused. He stopped drinking for a while. But when he booked a comeback role in an indie film, the pressure returned. He began staying out late again, the charm cracking into aggression. On the night of March 11th, police were called to the house after neighbors heard shouting and a crash. When officers arrived, they found Talia unconscious at the bottom of the stairs. Dean was kneeling beside her, sobbing, insisting she'd fallen. He smelled of alcohol. There was a broken wine bottle on the floor and blood smeared across the railing. The paramedics pronounced her dead on arrival. A fractured skull, internal bleeding, but the bruises on her wrists told another story, finger marks, deep and distinct. Detectives began to suspect this wasn't an accident. Dean's version changed with every interview. First, he said they'd been arguing about money. Then, that she'd slipped while carrying laundry. Finally, that she'd tripped during an argument and he'd tried to catch her. But the coroner's report noted something chilling. The trajectory of her injuries suggested she'd been pushed from halfway up the staircase. And the time of death, around 2:17 a.m., matched the timestamp on a voicemail she'd sent her sister just minutes earlier. "He's drunk again. I don't feel safe tonight." The media tore into the story. Overnight, Dean went from nostalgic TV favorite to Hollywood's latest villain. Tabloids ran old photos of him laughing at premieres beside headlines that read, "From stardom to scandal." He was arrested 2 days later. The mugshot showed a man unrecognizable, pale, swollen eyes, a faint trace of disbelief. In court, his lawyer claimed it was a tragic accident. The defense tried to paint him as a broken man struggling with addiction, remorseful but not murderous. But the prosecution had evidence. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera showing Dean dragging Talia's body back inside minutes after the fall. Panicking, trying to wipe the blood from the stairs before calling 911. The trial lasted 7 weeks. His old co-stars sat in the gallery for a few days, then quietly disappeared. No one wanted to be photographed there. When the verdict came, guilty of second-degree murder, Dean just nodded. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He only stared at the floor, lips moving silently, like he was still reading lines from a script. He was sentenced to 22 years. His last interview before being transferred to state prison was strange and hollow. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said softly. "But sometimes I think maybe Hollywood kills you before you ever die." Talia's family established a memorial scholarship for women pursuing careers behind the camera. At the first ceremony, her sister spoke through tears. She wanted to help people tell stories. "I just wish she'd known hers wouldn't end like one." The house in the hills was later rented by a new couple, influencers chasing their own slice of fame. Within months, they moved out, saying they kept hearing a voice from the staircase late at night, a woman whispering, "Please stop." And in the city that turns tragedy into content, her story became another cautionary tale, another ghost in the bright lights, proof that fame can gild, even the darkest crime until you can't. Tell where the performance ends and the truth begins. The sunset over Laurel Canyon bled through the blinds of the studio apartment, streaking the walls in gold and shadow. To anyone passing by, it looked like another small Hollywood dream. One bedroom, low rent, a view of the hills if you leaned out far enough. Inside, 29-year-old talent manager Ryan Keller was arguing with his newest client, a young pop singer named Lila Reed. The argument would end in blood, though no one yet knew that. Ryan had built his name on charm. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, who bought drinks for strangers and promised them a future. "You're going to be huge," he'd tell them, and somehow they believed it. But behind that veneer was control, a quiet, relentless need to own the people he helped. Lila was supposed to be his masterpiece. She was 19, fresh out of a small Texas town, her voice raw and soulful. When Ryan found her at an open mic in Echo Park, he told her she reminded him of the next Amy Winehouse. Within months, he'd gotten her a record deal and moved her into his building. What she didn't realize then was that every step closer to fame pulled her deeper into his grasp. Texts later recovered by investigators showed how the manipulation began. Compliments turning to commands, support turning to threats. "You don't need to talk to other managers," he'd texted. "They just want to ruin what we have." Friends noticed she'd stopped answering calls, stopped showing up to sessions without him. Her social media posts grew erratic, cheerful captions paired with eyes that looked tired, scared. On the night of September 3rd, neighbors reported shouting, glass breaking. One neighbor, an older woman in the next apartment, told police she heard Ryan yelling, "You think you can leave me now? After everything I did for you." Then came silence and the sound of running water. When officers entered the unit the next morning, they found Lila's body in the bathtub. The water had gone cold. Ryan was gone. A single note on the counter read, "I didn't mean to." The manhunt lasted 3 days. They found him in a motel off Highway 5, unshaven, dazed, with empty pill bottles scattered around him. He told police he'd tried to take his own life. Instead, he survived and confessed. But even his confession was strange. "It wasn't supposed to go that way," he said. She said she was leaving. "I just wanted to talk." The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to her head and ligature marks around her neck. She had struggled. He had held her under. The coroner called it homicide. The trial revealed the rot beneath the glamour. Emails showed how Ryan had siphoned money from her record advances, keeping her financially trapped. Friends testified that he isolated her, monitored her movements, even intercepted calls from her mother. The prosecution called it a textbook case of coercive control turned deadly. During the sentencing, the judge's voice was flat. "You built a cage and called it love," she said. Ryan was given life in prison without parole. He bowed his head and whispered something no one could hear. Lila's debut album, which had been scheduled for release that same month, came out posthumously. It topped charts for weeks. Critics called it hauntingly pure. But those who'd known her said it was unbearable to listen to. Her last recorded song, Hollow Lights, ended with a quiet refrain, her voice cracking as she sang, "He said the city loved me, but I don't feel safe here." Fans still leave flowers on the steps outside that apartment complex. The building manager says no one stays in her old unit for long. Tenants say they sometimes hear humming through the walls late at night, faint, distant, and heartbreakingly beautiful. And somewhere in the archives of Hollywood's endless tragedies, her story became another headline that faded too soon. But for those who still remember her voice, she remains frozen in time, a song cut short, in a city that applauds when the curtain falls, no matter who it buries underneath. The night was humid and heavy with the smell of rain on asphalt when the call came in. 10:46 p.m., West Hollywood. The dispatcher logged it as domestic disturbance, possible weapon. The address belonged to someone the city knew too well. Evan Marshall, a 34-year-old film composer whose soundtracks had won him 2 Golden Globes and the devotion of millions. His music was emotional, cinematic, filled with longing. The irony was that behind those haunting notes lived a man who had forgotten how to feel anything at all. Evan had met his wife, Clara Monroe, on the set of an independent film 6 years earlier. She was an actress trying to make a comeback after a long hiatus, and he was the quiet genius behind the score. Friends described them as magnetic opposites. She filled every room with warmth, while he floated somewhere just outside the noise, aloof and intense. Their chemistry was undeniable, but so were the cracks. By their 3rd anniversary, those close to them whispered about Evan's temper, his obsession with control, his paranoia about Clara's career taking off while his began to stall. By the summer of 2018, Clara had landed a breakout role. Interviews painted her as Hollywood's comeback queen. Evan stopped attending her premieres. Instead, he spent nights alone in his home studio, composing in darkness, headphones clamped tight. Neighbors said they often heard shouting from the house after midnight, muffled, rhythmic, like a fight that had become routine. That night, when the police arrived, the front door was ajar. A half-finished glass of whiskey sat beside the piano. The lights were still on in the studio. Clara lay on the floor, motionless, her head resting in a pool of blood. Evan was sitting against the wall, face streaked with tears, his hands trembling but empty. "It was an accident," he said softly. "I didn't mean to hit her that hard." He told police they'd argued about her plans to leave. She wanted space, maybe a separation. He wanted her to stay, to fix things. The fight turned physical. The glass she threw had shattered against the piano, cutting his arm. In his rage, he'd struck her once, too hard. The autopsy revealed 2 blows to the skull and defensive wounds on her arms. Detectives noticed something else. On the piano, an unfinished sheet of music. The title, Clara's Lament. The melody was dark, erratic, broken by pauses that felt deliberate, as if he'd composed it in the middle of their argument. The timestamps on the digital file confirmed it. He had been recording while she was dying. When this detail reached the press, it became the story that gripped Los Angeles. A composer who turned his crime into a requiem. The tabloids called him the soundtrack killer. Record sales of his older work spiked. Streaming platforms pulled his music within a week. In court, the prosecution framed it as a crime of obsession. A man who couldn't accept losing control over the one person who saw through him. His defense lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, that Evan was in a mental break, that he'd lost touch with reality after years of isolation. But the jury listened to the tape played aloud, the soft argument building into screams, the crash of glass, and finally the single dull thud that ended her life. Then silence, followed by a piano chord. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. As he was led away, a reporter shouted, "Do you regret what you did?" He paused for a long moment before saying, "Regret is a sound that never ends." Months later, Clara's final film was released to critical acclaim. In the credits, under Music By, was a new composer's name. But those who listened closely during the final scene swore they could still hear something faint, like an echo. The ghost of a piano note, fading into nothing. The house was sold to a family from out of state. They said they loved the acoustics, the way music seemed to linger in the walls. But on rainy nights when the air gets heavy, they say the piano sometimes plays on its own. 3 soft notes, the beginning of an unfinished song. In the mid-1990s, when the film industry was drunk on money and fame, a man named Franklin Dorsey ruled its shadows. He wasn't a director or actor. He was a fixer, the man studios called when someone famous made a mess. Drugs, affairs, accidents, even the occasional overdose. Franklin was the one who made it disappear. He was invisible, and that made him powerful. By 2002, he'd cleaned up after half of Hollywood. He had access to private photos, contracts, tapes, enough secrets to destroy careers overnight. People feared him, but they also needed him. He lived alone in a mid-century house off Sunset Boulevard, walls lined with expensive art and silent telephones that never stopped ringing. Then, one morning in May, Franklin was found dead. His housekeeper arrived to find the alarm off, the back door open, and Franklin's body sprawled in his study. He'd been shot twice in the chest, execution style. No signs of forced entry, no gun at the scene. On his desk, Detectives found a neat stack of manila envelopes, each labeled with a celebrity's name. Inside, photographs, financial records, and handwritten notes. Blackmail material. Decades worth. The murder sent shockwaves through the industry. Whispers spread fast. Who killed Franklin Dorsey? And how many powerful people had reason to? Detectives began unraveling his private dealings. Extortion, manipulation, silent payoffs. His client list read like an awards ceremony. One actress, questioned privately, broke down crying and said he'd ruined her career after she refused his demands. Another, a producer, admitted to paying him hundreds of thousands to bury a scandal that would have destroyed his studio. Within days, 3 separate suspects emerged. The first, a washed-up actor whose affair Franklin had exposed years earlier. The second, a rival fixer who'd lost clients to Franklin's ruthless methods. And the third, a young assistant named Maxine, who'd vanished the night of the murder. Police tracked Maxine down a week later, hiding in a motel near Bakersfield. She confessed, but not to murder. She said she'd found Franklin dead when she arrived that morning. She'd panicked, taken a few files and run. Everyone hated him, she told detectives, but no one had the guts to stop him. The trail went cold until the coroner's office discovered something strange. Franklin's hands were clean, no gunpowder residue, and the angle of the shots suggested someone shorter had fired upward. Then came the real break. Surveillance footage from a private gate camera nearby showing a black SUV leaving the property at 3:18 a.m. The car was registered to a major studio executive, one of Franklin's oldest clients. When police brought the executive in for questioning, he denied everything. But the evidence grew damning. Phone records, money transfers, deleted emails. It turned out Franklin had threatened to leak documents proving the executive had embezzled millions in production funds. The night before his death, Franklin had sent a message that read, "If I don't get what you owe me by morning, everyone will know." The trial was short but sensational. Hollywood turned inward, terrified of what might surface next. Reporters described the courthouse as a feeding frenzy. The executive's lawyers argued self-defense, claiming Franklin had been armed. But no weapon was ever found, and no fingerprints except the executive's were on the bullets. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years. But the story didn't end there. Before his arrest, dozens of Franklin's files went missing from police custody, quietly erased, destroyed, or stolen. Some say they were bought off by the same people Franklin had once protected. In the years since, rumors of his archive have become urban legend. Every few months, a new anonymous email surfaces claiming to have the Dorsey files, a cache of secrets capable of ruining Hollywood again. None have ever been verified, but among old reporters there's a saying, whispered half in fear, half in awe. You can kill a man, but you can't kill his leverage. And every now and then, when another scandal breaks, someone inevitably says the same chilling thing. Looks like Dorsey's ghost made another call. There are stories in Hollywood that don't make the front page until years later, when the glamour has faded and the truth finally crawls out of the dark. The story of Emily Stanton was one of them, a story that began with flashing cameras and ended with silence so heavy it seemed to hang over the entire city. Emily was born for fame. Blonde, brilliant, and unnervingly poised, she was the child of 2 actors who'd lived and died in the tabloids. By 24, she had her first leading role, a psychological thriller that catapulted her into stardom. She smiled perfectly on red carpets, laughed through interviews, and played the role of Hollywood's next golden girl flawlessly. But behind the charm, there was fear, the kind that comes from being watched by everyone, including the man who promised to make her a star. That man was Victor Sloan, her agent, a name whispered with both admiration and dread in the industry. He discovered young actors like he was mining gold, polishing them, molding them, then controlling them completely. To his clients, he was a mentor. To those who left him, he was a ghost who made sure their careers never recovered. Emily signed with him at 19. He got her into the best circles, the biggest roles. But he also monitored her every move, the roles she took, the friends she made, even who she dated. He said I owed him everything, she told a friend once. I think he meant it literally. By the time she turned 28, her tone in interviews had changed. The light in her voice dimmed. She started missing events, canceling shoots. Rumors spread that she was unstable, difficult, on drugs. That's what Victor told the press. In reality, she had been trying to cut ties with him. On a rainy Tuesday in February 2017, Emily was found dead in her Hollywood Hills mansion. The official story, suicide by overdose. The tabloids ran with it, complete with glossy photos of her smiling in better days. The industry mourned for a week, and then moved on. But something about it felt wrong. Her assistant, who discovered the body, told police Emily had been in good spirits. She was planning to fly to New York that weekend for a new project, one Victor hadn't arranged. There was no suicide note, no sign of struggle. Her phone was missing. The coroner listed her death as undetermined, citing a lethal mix of prescription medication and alcohol. But when her toxicology report leaked months later, it revealed something strange. Traces of a sedative that had never been prescribed to her. The investigation reopened quietly. Detectives learned that Victor had visited her home 2 nights before she died. He told them it was a routine business meeting. Security cameras from the neighborhood confirmed his car had been parked outside for nearly 2 hours. Inside her house, no sign of forced entry, just one wine glass on the table. The deeper police dug, the darker it got. Multiple former clients of Victor came forward with eerily similar stories. Emotional abuse, blackmail, threats of sabotage. One of them produced a series of emails from him saying, "No one leaves me without consequences." But the most damning piece of evidence came from a hard drive recovered from his office. It contained recordings of his calls with clients, hundreds of them. In one file dated a week before Emily's death, his voice was calm, calculated. "You walk away, you die in silence," he told her. When detectives confronted him, Victor denied everything. His lawyers claimed the recordings were doctored, but forensic analysts authenticated them. Days before trial, Victor fled the country. He was found 6 months later in Lisbon, living under an alias using a stolen passport. Extradition followed swiftly. In court, the prosecution described him as a predator in a tailored suit. They painted a picture of decades of control and coercion, actors broken under his watch, careers destroyed at his whim. Emily's death, they said, was the final act of his power. The defense clung to the suicide narrative, but it fell apart when the assistant testified about the missing phone. Investigators had eventually found it, hidden behind a false wall in Victor's office. On it were unsent voice notes Emily had recorded in the days before her death. In one, her voice shook as she said, "He's coming here tonight. I told him no more, but he doesn't listen." The courtroom went silent when it played. Even Victor looked down. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The judge's final words cut through the noise. "You built an empire on the backs of broken souls. This one finally broke you." Years later, filmmakers tried to make a biopic about Emily, a tribute, they said. But every attempt fell apart. Directors dropped out. Scripts were abandoned. Some said the project was cursed. Her old home stands empty now, the gate locked, the garden overgrown. Locals claim that at night you can hear faint footsteps on the balcony, and sometimes the echo of a camera shutter, as if someone's still taking her picture. And though Hollywood moved on, her story lingers, a reminder that in this city, fame isn't light. It's fire, and some people, like Emily, are burned alive just trying to touch it. Hollywood has a way of hiding its scars beneath glitter, but some stories cut deep enough that even time can't cover them. The case of Daniel Reeve, a beloved television actor turned murderer, was one of those. Daniel's rise was the kind of story agents love to tell. Born in a small town in Michigan, he arrived in Los Angeles at 19 with $200 and a headshot. Within 5 years, he'd landed a recurring role on a major network series, the kind of glossy drama that kept families glued to their screens. By 30, he was on magazine covers, smiling beside co-stars who called him the nicest guy in Hollywood. Behind that easy smile, though, something darker had been growing. His temper was legendary among crew members. He hated retakes, blamed others for missed cues, and once punched a wall after a lighting delay. But because he looked like a hero, the studio brushed it off. Method acting, they called it. When the show ended, Daniel's fame began to fade. He tried films, they flopped. Tried producing, failed again. The money shrank, the offers stopped coming. By 2015, he was 41, divorced, and living alone in the Hollywood Hills. His only regular visitor was his ex-wife, Olivia, a costume designer who still checked on him out of guilt or maybe habit. In June 2016, Olivia went missing. She was last seen leaving his house after what neighbors described as a loud argument. Her car was found abandoned 3 blocks away. Her phone off. Police questioned Daniel immediately. He claimed she'd left upset after refusing to reconcile. He even cried during the interview. They let him go. Days passed. Search parties combed the canyons. Flyers plastered streetlights and coffee shops. Social media turned her disappearance into a trending topic. Daniel posted a heartfelt video on Instagram, pleading for help. "Please, if anyone's seen her, bring her home. She's the love of my life." Millions viewed it. Few realized how rehearsed it sounded. 2 weeks later, hikers discovered a shallow grave in the Angeles National Forest. Inside was Olivia. Her skull was fractured, her wrists bound with fabric matching the curtains from Daniel's living room. When detectives arrived at his house with a warrant, he was in the middle of a live stream, smiling, answering fan questions, pretending nothing had happened. They arrested him mid-sentence. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed his car near the forest on the night she vanished. Blood traces were found in his trunk, wiped but still detectable under luminol. On his laptop, deleted search histories. How to hide body in forest. How deep grave to avoid animals. At first, Daniel denied everything. He blamed a stalker who'd been harassing them both. Then, in a strange twist, he began speaking to the press from jail. "Hollywood broke me," he said in one interview. "You play the hero long enough, you forget who you are when the cameras stop." During the trial, the prosecution played his old show clips side by side with police interrogation tapes. The contrast was chilling. The same voice, the same charm, but no script this time. Just lies collapsing one by one. A former assistant testified that Daniel had been stalking Olivia for months. He'd hacked her phone, monitored her location, and once bragged that she'll come back to me one way or another. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, the pressures of fame, the collapse of his career. But the jury didn't buy it. In July 2018, Daniel Reeve was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. Inside prison, Daniel became something of a spectacle. Inmates called him Hollywood. He signed autographs on napkins, rehearsed lines in the yard, and reportedly told a cellmate, "At least now I've got a captive audience." Meanwhile, the studio quietly pulled reruns of his show. His face disappeared from billboards, streaming services, DVD covers. It was as if he'd been erased, but his crime wasn't forgotten. A true crime documentary aired 2 years later. In it, a detective said, "Daniel didn't kill her because of love. He killed her because she left his script." He couldn't stand not being in control of the story. Now, when people drive past his old house, they notice the front window still boarded up, the paint peeling. Locals swear they can sometimes hear a man rehearsing lines late at night, muffled words that stop abruptly, followed by silence. It's a strange kind of justice, a man who lived for attention now trapped in a world that refuses to look at him. And maybe that's what Hollywood does best. It turns fame into ghosts. The ocean was quiet that night, too quiet for the lights that floated off the coast of Catalina Island. The air was cool, the water black and glassy. Somewhere out there on a 60-foot yacht named Splendor, one of Hollywood's brightest stars was laughing, drinking, and arguing with the people who loved her most. By morning, she would be gone. Natalie Wood had lived most of her life under the glow of studio lights. Born Natalia Zakharenko, she had stepped in front of a camera before she could spell her own name. By the age of 10, she was already a star, her face known across America. She was small, graceful, and radiant, the kind of actress whose sadness showed even when she smiled. Through Rebel Without a Cause, West Side Story, and Splendor in the Grass, she had become an icon. But fame, like tidewater, always pulls in 2 directions. By 1981, Natalie was 43 and tired of living under public magnification. She had found love again with actor Robert Wagner, the man she'd married, divorced, and remarried, a loop of passion and volatility that everyone in Hollywood seemed to gossip about. They fought fiercely, loved fiercely, and never seemed able to leave each other for long. That Thanksgiving weekend, Natalie invited Wagner and her co-star Christopher Walken to spend a few quiet days aboard Splendor. They had just finished filming the science fiction drama Brainstorm together, and Natalie thought a short trip would help her unwind. The yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, managed the vessel and knew both Natalie and Robert well. The 4 of them set sail from Marina del Rey toward Catalina Island. Photographs from the start of the trip show a smiling Natalie in a red jacket, wind pushing her hair back, her arm linked through Wagner's. But beneath those smiles, tension brewed. Walken and Wagner had been quietly competing for Natalie's attention during filming, and the gossip columns had already hinted at something more than friendship between Natalie and her charismatic co-star. That Saturday evening, the group dined at Doug's Harbor Reef, a small restaurant on the island. Waitstaff would later recall laughter that turned sharp, voices raised, glasses clinking too hard against the table. They returned to the yacht sometime after 10 p.m. The sea had turned rough, the wind moaning against the hull. According to the captain, more drinking followed. Words grew louder, then slurred, then angry. Davern said he heard Wagner accusing Walken of trying to take his wife away. Walken tried to defuse it, saying that Natalie was dedicated to her family, to her work. But Wagner's temper was famous. Friends had seen it before. On the deck, the argument escalated until Natalie stormed off. At some point later, everything went silent. Just after midnight, Wagner realized she was gone. The small inflatable dinghy, the Valiant, was also missing. He called the Coast Guard around 1:30 a.m. A search began under blinding spotlights and the slap of helicopter blades. At 7:44 a.m., a patrol boat found her body floating face down about a mile away. She was wearing a red jacket and flannel nightgown, her dark hair tangled in seaweed. The official explanation came quickly: accidental drowning. The coroner suggested she had tried to secure the dinghy, slipped, and fallen into the water. She couldn't swim well, and the heavy jacket would have dragged her under. Hollywood mourned. The news played on every television set. Black and white footage of a smiling Natalie spliced against footage of the search boats. She was eulogized as a tragic beauty taken too soon. The case was closed within weeks, but the silence that followed never sat right with those who'd known her. Captain Davern struggled with guilt and contradictions. In later interviews, he said the story the police accepted wasn't the full truth, that there had been shouting, breaking glass, sounds of a struggle. He claimed that after the argument, Wagner had kept him from turning on the searchlights right away, saying Natalie had just taken the dinghy. Wagner denied it. He said the night had been chaotic, confusing, clouded by alcohol. He insisted he loved her, that he had searched desperately. The dinghy was later found beached a short distance from where her body was recovered, its ignition off, oars still in place. Odd details for an accidental escape into dark, rough water. Years passed, and the mystery refused to fade. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation after new testimony from Davern and fresh analysis of bruises found on Natalie's body. Experts noted marks on her arms and legs consistent with a struggle, not a fall. The cause of death was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Reporters swarmed again. Old photographs resurfaced. The case that had haunted Hollywood for 3 decades returned to headlines. But the ocean keeps its secrets well. No charges were ever filed, and the investigation remained officially unresolved. Behind the headlines lay a deeper tragedy, the way the industry devours its own. Natalie had always been afraid of dark water. She once told an interviewer that she couldn't bear the idea of drowning, that the sound of waves at night made her anxious. Friends said she avoided boats whenever possible. Yet on that final weekend, she was persuaded to step aboard, to play the part of the perfect wife, the perfect host. Her funeral drew crowds of stars and strangers. The church overflowed with cameras flashing against black veils. Robert Wagner stood beside her casket, expression unreadable, surrounded by the same press that had once chronicled every move of their romance. Christopher Walken kept his distance, pale and silent, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. The pastor spoke of grace and mystery. Outside, the sea wind carried the smell of salt and flowers. Over the years, the story became a kind of Hollywood legend, half investigation, half ghost story. People argued over theories. Did she fall? Did someone push her? Was it rage, jealousy, accident, or fate? But for all the speculation, what endured most was the image of her, frozen forever in youth, in beauty, in unfinished light. Documentaries revisited the case. Podcasts dissected it frame by frame. Yet none of them could fill the gaps left by that night's silence. What happened between the laughter at the restaurant and the splash in the dark remains the unanswered heartbeat of the story. To understand Natalie Wood's final hours, one must also understand the city she belonged to. Hollywood was built on illusions, on the belief that you can rewrite pain, retake the past, reshoot the truth until it shines. Natalie spent her life doing just that, surviving in a system that valued perfection over peace. But some stories, no matter how often retold, refuse to fit a happy ending. The captain later said he sometimes hears her voice when the sea is calm, when the deck lights of another yacht glimmer just offshore. He remembers the laughter, the way she leaned on the railing to look at the stars. He said the water seemed to glow around her, like she belonged there, even though she feared it. In the decades since, every few years someone new tries to close the story, to name a culprit, to erase the uncertainty. But the truth is tangled like the ropes that tied Splendor to its moorings that night, pulled by memory, by guilt, by the tide itself. What's left is the echo of a woman who spent her life performing for a world that never stopped watching her. Sometimes, when film historians screen her old movies, the audience grows quiet during the final close-ups, the ones where her eyes seem to search past the camera toward something distant. Those who knew her say that was always Natalie's gift. She made you believe there was something just beyond the frame, something you couldn't quite reach. And maybe that's where she still is, not lost, not gone, but somewhere just beyond the edge of light on the water. The night that took her has never really ended. It rolls in again and again, each time the world remembers her name. Natalie Wood remains a symbol of Hollywood's brightest dream and its darkest consequence. A reminder that in this town built on stories, some of the most powerful are the ones that will never, ever be finished. The mansion stood at the edge of Alhambra, east of Los Angeles, a castle built by a man who once defined the sound of American pop. Its walls were lined with gold records, portraits of legends, and the echoes of a life that had burned too brightly for too long. Inside that house, in the early hours of February 3, 2003, a gunshot broke the silence, and Hollywood awoke to another tragedy that would never quite fade. Phil Spector was already a myth. In the 1960s, he had created what journalists called the Wall of Sound, dense orchestral pop that transformed teenage love songs into symphonies. He produced hits for the Ronettes, the Crystals, the Righteous Brothers, the Beatles. His music filled radios and movie soundtracks. His temper filled rumor columns. People said he was brilliant, erratic, volatile. He liked control, over sound, over rooms, over people. By the late 1990s, Spector had withdrawn from the spotlight. The rock and roll genius who once stood behind glass in recording studios now lived mostly behind gates. He still entertained, but friends described a man trapped by paranoia and loneliness. Guns were part of his legend. Several women later recalled nights when parties turned tense, when the host waved a pistol as casually as a drink. Lana Clarkson came from the opposite end of the Hollywood spectrum. A tall, striking model-turned-actress, she had worked steadily through the 1980s in low-budget fantasy films and bit parts on television. By 40, she was restarting her career, working at the House of Blues in West Hollywood while chasing new auditions. She was known for her warmth, her humor, and her refusal to give up on the dream that had brought her west. On the night of February 2, 2003, their paths crossed. Spector arrived at the club in a chauffeured Mercedes, quiet at first, then drinking heavily in a private booth. Employees remembered him as eccentric but polite. Clarkson greeted him at the door, as she did every guest. Security cameras later showed them leaving together around 2 a.m. She told co-workers she was giving him a quick ride to his home, just to be nice. The drive to Alhambra took less than an hour. The chauffeur, Adriano de Souza, waited outside while Spector and Clarkson went into the house. Minutes stretched into nearly 2 hours. Then around 5 a.m., de Souza heard a loud crack, a single gunshot echoing from inside the marble foyer. Moments later, Spector appeared at the back door, holding a revolver loosely at his side. According to the chauffeur's statement, Spector said, "I think I just shot somebody." De Souza called 911. Police arrived to find Clarkson slumped in a chair by the front door, a bullet wound through her mouth. The pistol lay at her feet. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The image of the reclusive producer in handcuffs spread instantly across the world's front pages. At first, Spector insisted her death had been an accident, claiming Clarkson had kissed the gun. Detectives weren't convinced. They found blood spatter on his white jacket, a pattern suggesting proximity and discharge at arm's length. They also uncovered stories from 5 women who described nearly identical incidents over the years. Arguments, guns drawn, threats when they tried to leave. Spector's attorneys built their defense on doubt. There were no witnesses inside the room, only 2 people and a gun. They said Lana Clarkson had been despondent over her fading career, that she might have turned the weapon on herself. Prosecutors countered with forensic evidence, traces of gunshot residue on Spector's right hand, the angle of the wound, the absence of fingerprints on the gun handle. They described a pattern of control that finally exploded into violence. The first trial in 2007 ended with a hung jury. 10 jurors voted to convict, 2 held out. The mistrial left the public split. Half saw an eccentric genius misunderstood. Half saw a man protected by fame and wealth. 2 years later, prosecutors tried again. The second trial was longer, colder, more precise. New forensic experts demonstrated that Clarkson could not have pulled the trigger herself given the trajectory of the bullet. The women from Spector's past returned to testify, their stories almost interchangeable. An invitation, an argument, a gun, terror. After 6 months of testimony and 30 deliberation hours, the jury found Phil Spector guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 19 years to life. When the verdict was read, he barely moved. Outside, television trucks lined the street. Reporters spoke of justice, of fallen idols, of the strange symmetry between art and destruction. For Lana Clarkson's family, the conviction brought little comfort. Her mother spoke softly at the sentencing, saying her daughter had believed kindness could change people. She thought she could calm him, she said, and he killed her for it. Spector was transferred to a state prison hospital because of health problems. In interviews recorded before his decline, he still maintained his innocence, often shifting between bravado and bitterness. "You can't be a genius in this world without being called crazy," he told one journalist, staring past the camera. "They loved my madness when it made hits." He spent his final years behind concrete walls, hearing echoes of the music that had once ruled the charts. Lana Clarkson's friends kept her memory alive through a small foundation for young performers. Quiet work that never made headlines. When Phil Spector died in 2021 from COVID-19 complications, newspapers replayed the same uneasy duality. Architect of the modern pop sound, convicted killer. His songs still played on oldie stations. Be My Baby, You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', Imagine. But listeners heard them differently now, aware of the life that had ended in his shadow. The mansion in Alhambra remains, its towers and turrets rising over quiet suburban streets. New owners repainted the walls, removed the bullet-scarred doors, filled the halls with fresh furniture. Yet neighbors say that on some nights, when the wind moves through the palms, the place still hums faintly, as if the reverberation of that single gunshot lingers between the gold record frames. In the end, the story of Phil Spector and Lana Clarkson became another Hollywood parable about talent and ruin. It asked the same question that echoes through so many of the city's tragedies. How far brilliance can stretch before it tears completely? Spector built cathedrals of sound to contain his own chaos, and for a time it worked. But genius can't rewrite gravity, and control is never permanent. Not in music, not in life. For those who remember Lana Clarkson, the story isn't about him at all. It's about a woman who still believed, even at 40, that she had one more good role left in her, one more chance to make it. That night she stepped into a car with a man she barely knew, trusting the promise of kindness, of conversation, of maybe another opportunity. Instead, she became a footnote in someone else's legend. Hollywood moves on quickly, but sometimes, when an old Spector production drifts from a passing car, the reverb seems a little too thick, the echo too long, like the sound itself remembers what he did, and refuses to fade. The lights of Studio City never really go dark. They only dim, leaving the glow of diners and old neon signs to hum against the Los Angeles night. On May 4, 2001, one of those signs, Vitello's, a neighborhood Italian restaurant, stood quietly at the corner of Tujunga Avenue. Inside, an aging actor named Robert Blake shared dinner with his wife, Bonnie Lee Backley. To everyone else in the restaurant, they looked like an ordinary couple finishing a late meal. In truth, the evening marked the last quiet moment before a mystery that would haunt Hollywood for decades. Robert Blake had been a familiar face in American film for half a century. From a child role in Our Gang to the hard-bitten detective in Beretta, he'd lived his life under camera lights. He was blunt, mercurial, sometimes endearing and sometimes feared, a man whose success always carried an undercurrent of volatility. By 2001, his career had cooled, but he still carried the aura of someone who had once commanded a set. Bonnie Lee Bakley was different. She had grown up chasing stardom from afar, writing letters to celebrities, attending fan events, and reinventing herself through aliases and glamour photos. When she met Blake in the late 1990s, she was living a precarious life between admiration and obsession with fame. Their relationship was sudden and uneven, Blake older and wary, Bakley restless and determined to secure a future for herself and their infant daughter, Rosie. That Friday night in May, Blake parked his black Dodge Stealth a few blocks from Vitello's, a habit meant to avoid the cramped lot. After dinner, the couple walked back toward the car. They talked about the meal, about the baby waiting at home, about small things that fill the air before the unthinkable. At about 10:15 p.m., Blake realized, he later told police, that he'd left his gun inside the restaurant. He left Bakley in the passenger seat and walked back to retrieve it. Minutes later, residents heard a single gunshot echo through the street. When Blake returned to the car, Bonnie Lee Bakley was slumped against the seatbelt, a wound in her head, blood on the window. The bullet had come from a revolver fired at close range. Blake pounded on doors, shouting for help, insisting that someone call 911. Paramedics rushed Bakley to St. Joseph's Medical Center, but she was pronounced dead soon after arrival. The scene drew immediate attention. A murdered woman, a famous husband, a quiet neighborhood now lit by police floodlights. Investigators from the Los Angeles Police Department sealed off the block and began their slow, methodical sweep. They found a .38 caliber revolver in a nearby dumpster, an unregistered weapon that, forensic tests would later confirm, was the gun used to kill Bakley. There were no fingerprints. No witnesses had seen anyone approach the car. And so the question emerged, who could have pulled the trigger? At first, Blake appeared cooperative. He gave statements, reenacted his walk to the restaurant, and even took a polygraph test. But detectives couldn't shake their unease. His story, leaving his wife alone in a dark street to retrieve a forgotten gun, seemed too neat, too cinematic. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation tightened around him. The media, always drawn to irony, filled the airwaves with headlines about the Beretta star's real-life murder mystery. Behind closed doors, the police gathered a picture of a marriage built on mistrust. Friends said Blake felt trapped, convinced that Bakley had deceived him about her past and used him for fame. Letters surfaced suggesting tension over money and fidelity. None of it proved murder, but it created a portrait that fascinated tabloids, a tragic script no writer could invent. In 2002, nearly a year after the shooting, detectives made their move. Robert Blake was arrested outside his home and charged with murder, along with solicitation to commit murder. Two former stuntmen claimed Blake had approached them months earlier, asking if they knew anyone who could take care of a problem. Both men had criminal pasts. Their stories were shaky, their motives uncertain, but their claims were enough to push the case forward. The trial that followed, beginning in December 2004, played out like a dark revival of Blake's Hollywood past. Prosecutors argued that the actor had grown desperate to free himself from a marriage he never wanted. They laid out the inconsistencies in his timeline, the supposed attempts to find a hitman, the improbability of a random shooter appearing on that quiet street. Blake's defense, led by Thomas Mesereau, countered with precision. They dismantled the prosecution's witnesses, pointing out contradictions and vanished credibility. The stuntmen recanted parts of their stories. The gun found in the dumpster bore no prints linking it to Blake. No gunshot residue was discovered on his hands or clothes, and the missing moments between his leaving the restaurant and discovering the body remained a void no one could conclusively fill. As the trial dragged through winter and spring, the media camped outside the courthouse. Former colleagues and old fans filled the gallery. Inside, Blake sat motionless, his lined face unreadable, the cameras lingering on him each time testimony grew tense. To the public, it was a collision of nostalgia and horror, the small-screen detective now accused of a real-world killing. On March 16, 2005, after nearly 2 weeks of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of solicitation to murder. The room erupted with conflicting sighs. Relief from Blake's supporters, disbelief from others. Outside, reporters shouted questions as Blake raised his hands, trembling, whispering that God had answered his prayers. But the story didn't end there. Months later, a civil jury reached a different conclusion. In a wrongful death suit brought by Bakley's family, Blake was found liable for her death and ordered to pay $30 million in damages, later reduced to $15 million on appeal. The judgment bankrupted him. His home was sold, his possessions auctioned. He disappeared from public life, resurfacing occasionally in interviews where he spoke of betrayal, isolation, and faith. In the years that followed, Hollywood moved on, but the story of that night lingered. Vitello's kept its tables filled, yet visitors would glance toward the sidewalk outside and imagine the echoes of that single gunshot. True crime shows revisited the case again and again, each time searching for the piece that might make the puzzle whole. For detectives who'd worked the file, uncertainty became a burden. Evidence had been tested, theories exhausted, but the gap between what could be proved and what could only be guessed at remained unbridgeable. It was a mystery framed by fame, one that reminded everyone how the lights of Hollywood could blind as easily as they could illuminate. Robert Blake lived quietly in his later years, estranged from the industry that had once celebrated him. When he died in 2023 at the age of 89, obituaries called him a gifted actor and a man forever shadowed by tragedy. Bonnie Lee Backley's name, once lost amid the noise of the trial, has since been reclaimed by her family, remembered as more than a headline. As a mother, a woman who loved the idea of stardom and paid the highest price for stepping too close to its glow. In the end, the Robert Blake case stands as one of Hollywood's darkest parables, not just for its unanswered questions, but for the way it forced the city of illusion to look at itself, to see the thin line between performance and reality, between a role played for the camera and the private life lived after the director calls cut. When the credits roll on stories like these, there is no applause. Only the hum of traffic on Ventura Boulevard, the soft buzz of neon, and the reminder that even in the city of angels, innocence and guilt can blur until the truth itself fades like a forgotten script. Hollywood has always lived in the spotlight, but behind its fame there's a darkness that never fades. These were the crimes that changed everything. The lies, the loss, the secrets that still echo through the hills. Which of these stories stayed with you the most? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more true stories from behind the lights, the scandals, the mysteries, and the crimes that shaped Hollywood forever, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our next deep dive. Because here we don't just tell the stories of fame, we tell the ones fame tried to bury.